Joy gives us wings. In times of joy, our strength is more vital, our intellect keener, and our understanding less clouded. We seem better able to cope with the world and to find our sphere of usefulness. But when sadness visits us, we become weak. Our strength leaves us. Our comprehension is dim and our intelligence is veiled. The actualities of life seem to elude our grasp. The eyes of our spirits fail to discover the sacred mysteries, and we become even as dead beings. There is no human being untouched by these two influences, but all the sorrow and the grief that exist come from the world of matter. The spiritual world bestows only the joy. If we suffer, it is the outcome of material things, and all the trials and troubles come from this world of illusion. Abdul Baha.
Thank you. So today we're really happy to have Dr. John Woodall, and his topic is Sad Brain, Happy Brain, the Neuroscience of Spirituality. Dr. Woodall is a psychiatrist, formerly on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. He was director of the State Department refugee relief effort in the Balkans after the war there. He convened the Task Force for Accountability for War Crimes in the Balkans at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and advised the U.S. Senate and the International Criminal Tribunal on war crimes issues stemming from the Balkans War. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Dr. Woodall.
Imane, thank you so much. And Bayan, thank you for that perfect reading. You know, I couldn't have asked for a better beginning. We could spend all of the day just talking about the wisdom of that prayer and that wonderful quote of Abdul Baha. Friends, I'm very, very grateful to be here and to have the opportunity to speak about this extremely important topic. We're in a really, really rough time right now in the world's history, and we need to be really making effort to bring out the best in ourselves and each other. So I'm so grateful to you for hosting this series, because you're really giving us an opportunity to meet the challenges of this time with some confidence and hope. And there's nothing more important than that right now. So thank you. So, well, that's a good place to begin, is with humility. If we're going to be talking about the brain, the vast capacity of the brain and our spiritual nature. So, friends, I was asked some time ago about a presentation, and I've been thinking about laying foundations that can help us frame the challenges that we're facing. And I find it very helpful to understand some basic features of the brain in understanding my own reactions to the difficulties that life is presenting right now, and also that comes up daily with my work with my patients. So let's start here. Here's a graphic of the brain. And the first thing I want to do is introduce you to a concept of how the brain allows us to think, feel, behave, how it keeps the bodily functions moving. And it begins with the notion of something called a neural network that's illustrated here in this picture, where the brain has these connections between different centers in the brain. Much like the computers or the phones that we're watching this presentation on has circuitry, the brain has circuitry, and everything we think, feel, do, every bodily condition we have are all mediated across circuits, networks. We call them neural networks. So that's the first thought I wanted to elaborate on a little bit. So let's take it from there. Let's see, now I think we went too far. Let's start here. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now these networks are hard wiring of the brain. And I have a picture here that's superimposed over a dodo bird. Sorry about that. This is a picture of examples of wiring in the brain. These are cortical circuits that arise from the top of the brain and move down throughout the entire body. So just think of the brain as vast networks of interconnected parts. And these interconnections are called the neural networks of the brain. Okay. So here's an example. The top picture is a picture of the neural networks of maternal love, the love that a mother has for her child. And so what they did is they had the mother in a PET scan, and they asked her to think about her child, her new child. And these parts of the brain lit up. So imagine the connections between these parts of the brain as being and one example of maternal love, the neural network of maternal love. Now, the picture on the bottom is similar. It's a different form of love, romantic love. And now think about your husband. Think about the person you love, your wife, and so now different parts of the brain light up, and the connections between these parts of the brain are an example of a neural network for romantic love. So let's think about how the brain is structured a little bit here. So here's another diagram that shows three parts of the brain, although only two of them are mentioned or highlighted here. If you look at the picture, you can see the blue outer part of the brain. We're going to call that the cortex. The cortex is actually the very thin layer on the very outermost part of the brain, the cortex. It's a word that means bark. And so the cortex is the bark of the brain, the very outermost portion of the brain where all the thinking happens. And then, but just think of that blue area as the cortex or the neocortex, the new brain, the new cortex. The kind of burgundy color underneath that is the midbrain or sections of the midbrain. And the green portion is the brain stem. Now, just a little neuroscience about this and evolutionary science. It's very interesting because the reason that green part is called the reptilian brain is because we share that in common with lizards. Lizards have almost 90% of their brain, maybe even a little more than that, is just that green part. They don't have much of that purple part, and they don't have much of that blue part. They just have the green part. And what that part of the brain does is everything that's automatic. In humans, it's our blood pressure, our heart rate, our skin temperature, our body temperature, anything that we don't have to think about, including the fight or flight response. So this part of the brain is hardwired for survival. All of the things that we need to happen automatically to keep us alive. If we had to think about every single breath, well, we'd be dead pretty soon, right? Or if we had to think of initiating every heartbeat, well, that we wouldn't be able to do anything else. So the brain that keeps all of these automatic functions going is called the brain stem. And since that's primarily the only thing that a reptile has, and it's the thing we have in common with reptiles, it's called the reptilian brain as one of the names for the brain stem. Now, if you look at these three parts, imagine a Tootsie Pop that's got a stem, a chocolatey center, and that hard candy on the outside. So in a sense, our brain is kind of similarly constructed. It's got a stem, it's got a midbrain, and a cortex. And each of these has a different function. So we just talked about the brain stem. Talk a little bit about the other two, and then we'll elaborate more as we go on in the slides. The middle part of the brain has many functions, but for our purposes, we're going to talk about two in particular. One of them is emotions, and the other is memory. So this middle part of the brain controls many things, but things that are paraconscious. They're things that can happen automatically, but they also have volitional input. We can make choices about them, like memories. And a memory might pop up automatically, but we can also choose to remember certain things, or we can automatically feel outrage or disgust or joy or bliss. But so we can either choose it or it might just come upon us. So this is kind of that middle part of the brain that's partly conscious, partly not conscious. And the cortex is the part that is conscious. That is our thinking part of the brain, where well, everything we think, do, and feel is directed by the cortex. Now, I wanted to give one example before we move on. Let me just see what I've got for my next video, or my next slide here. All right, here's another example of that 3 parts. You see the orange brain stem and that bulb on top of it. Let's just call that the midbrain. And then the entire blue structure around it, that's the cortex. So let's just think for a second about how the average person, well, how all of us really are born, and how the trajectory of our growth. And I promise you, we're making a case for our spiritual life, but how it's embedded within the way our brain develops. So the brain stem is entirely involved in keeping us alive. Its sole purpose is our survival without having to think about it, sustaining our bodily functions so that we sustain life, right? So imagine that you're walking down the street and that you're maybe looking at your phone or reading a book or talking to someone on your phone, and you step out into the street and you're not really thinking about what you're doing. And all of a sudden you hear a car coming, you look up and there's a car coming right at you, and you immediately go like that, and your heart starts pounding, your breathing becomes very rapid, your muscles tense, and without even thinking, you jump out of the way, right? That's a perfect example of the fight or flight response, right? As soon as a threat is perceived, the brainstem kicks in, and a particular part of the brainstem called the locus ceruleus, which floods the body with the entire body with adrenaline, norepinephrine. And that kicks in an emergency response, kind of like the fire alarm at the high school when you're taking your math test. As soon as that fire alarm goes off, nothing else counts. You put your pen down. If you're in the gym, you stop playing basketball. Everybody lines up single file and out the door. Similarly, when the fight or flight response kicks in because of a threat like this car coming at us, whatever's on the phone, whoever we're talking to, immediately becomes unimportant, and the only thing that's important is survival. Now, a fascinating thing is, we jump out of the way before we even have a thought of the car coming. This process happens so quickly. It's a tenth of a second, and it takes around a second to actually think, here comes a car. But the emergency response bypasses the cortex and goes right to the brainstem and gets us out of the way, so that the brain thinking doesn't slow us down. It's fascinating and a highly efficient method to keep us safe. So now let's just follow the path of the fight or flight system for a little bit, and because it's going to make a point for the trajectory of our spiritual life and our mental life. So think of that adrenaline. We just talked about it taking over the body to allow us to jump out of the way, the heart increasing in rhythm, the breathing becoming faster, muscles tensing. But once that adrenaline hits that bulb area on top, that midbrain, it activates emotions and memories, because that's what that part of the brain does. So, for instance, think that let's switch a little bit from the example of the car and go to someone who, let's say, just made us angry, or we just became afraid of them, and so this adrenaline comes into the midbrain and activates emotions. So if we're thinking about an emotion that would help us flee or fight, the fight or flight syndrome or the process, what emotion would best help us fight? Well, the emotion that is most geared towards fighting is anger. So without thinking, we become angry. Let's say, a tiger is coming at us. And one of the options, although I don't recommend it, is getting angry at the tiger and fighting it so you can fight it. And the emotion keeps you focused on the task, right? Or fear. So you become fearful of the tiger so that you can run like crazy without being distracted by the nice scenery. So the purpose of emotions in these fight or flight responses is to keep us focused on survival, right? That's one of the reasons it's so difficult to stop being angry at somebody when we get angry at them, or if somebody makes us afraid. It's because there's a survival component to staying angry or staying afraid. So these become recurring circuits in our brain. Now, right next to the amygdala, which controls our emotions, is wrapped another brain structure called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus controls memory. So, and these two brain structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus, work very closely together, such that when we have a strong emotion, we file whatever the experience is we're having in our memory according to that emotion. It's almost like a file cabinet. There's a file cabinet for angry memories, a file cabinet for scared memories, a file cabinet for laughing memories, or loving memories. So we file our emotional memory in emotional cabinets, so to speak. That's why when you're angry at someone, all you can remember about them are all the ways they've ever made you angry, right? And that's kind of proof of how evil they are. You can think of a million reasons why you should be angry at them, but you don't remember the great time you just had a half hour ago, or the wonderful things they've done for you in the past, and you don't remember any of that because your anger only brings up the angry memories. And the anger itself has a survival a potency to it that keeps us angry. Same thing with fear. Now, that emotion and that adrenaline that initiated it goes to the cortex, that blue outer region of the brain. Now, everything we think about the situation is colored by these emotions. So now we perceive that whatever the person we're talking to who made us angry, or the person we're angry at, everything they say sounds suspicious. Everything they say, we assign motives to. That must be mean, or that must be diabolical, or undermining in some way. So we're suspicious and therefore react to them without trust and without a sense of trying to connect with them or understand them, because we feel threat from them. So the point of this entire explanation is to say that the brain is wired to keep us alive. This survival mechanism that's generated from the brainstem, hardwired into the brainstem, is intended to keep us alive as in two particular situations. One is when we're an infant, right? So we cry when we're hungry or afraid, or we squirm when we have gas, or we need to be held. That's one. And the second is as an adult, when there is a threat. But the way we evolved, this might happen, once in a week or something like that, when we're out hunting and we see a lion, and then we have 5 minutes to figure out if we, to settle the issue. We're either going to be lunch for the lion, or we're going to be safe. So this whole system was only meant to be activated for a couple of minutes. But in our culture, where so much is anxiety provoking, there's so many uncertainties, there's so many ways the culture tells us we're not safe or not good enough, that fight or flight response is active far, far more than it's intended to be biologically. So all of that to say this: that the better parts of our capacity, the or the thinking parts of our capacity, and the best abilities of our brain and our self don't reside in the brainstem and the midbrain. They're in the cortex. All of our cortical abilities that allow us to, think things through objectively, to be rational, to be objective, to be kind, to be cooperative, to explore and to do science and to do the arts and invent and be intuitive. All of those things and many, many more are in the cortex. So the gist of where we're going with this argument is to say that if the brain is being driven primarily by the brainstem, all of those wonderful abilities of the cortex remain dormant. And if you think about a baby, these abilities are latent within the baby's brain. They're not developed yet. They're like gems in a mine. They're there, but they're not brought out. They haven't been mined. They haven't been refined. They haven't been set in jewelry and put to use. They're latent. Similarly, in a baby's brain, capacities, maybe undreamed of capacities, are waiting to be unfolded. But they won't be unfolded as long as the brainstem is controlling the drive of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So I'm going to make one definition of spirituality as reversing this polarity of the brain from the brainstem to the cortex. The brainstem is hardwired from birth. It's going to do these things to keep us safe automatically without our thinking. But we need to cultivate these higher cortical abilities. It requires education, it requires training, it requires practice, it requires experience for those abilities to be made manifest, to be expressed in our lives. So again, the survival system of the brain is automatic and pre-wired and working at 100% when we're born. And the social abilities, the higher cortical functions, the spiritual capacities and sensibilities and capabilities are latent and require cultivation. So that's what we've spent all these last minutes making the point about. All right, let's keep moving. So this is a very primitive kind of notion of that. Imagine the control of the brain. That's what this is basically trying to do, coming from the brainstem and then branching into the cortex and going through the amygdala and the hippocampus that I was just talking about. Filtering through emotions and memory to color the way we think about someone. Again, think about, if you're angry at someone, and again, you can't think of anything about them that isn't anger producing or a reason why you shouldn't be angry at them. And then once you stop being angry, then you remember all these other parts about them in your relationship. And then you might say, oh my God, I owe them an apology. I was focused so much on my anger that I neglected all these other parts of our relationship. So again, the point being is that the brainstem drives the amygdala and the hippocampus, our memory and emotions, and those color the way we perceive, think, and act. Okay. All right, now here's actually a picture of that. It's a picture of the brainstem running the show. And they call this basic state of the brain when it's in an idle state or its resting state, where its basic programming is exhibited. We call that the default mode, and that's the scientific term for it. And the default mode, if you think of it like the idle on, let's say, a lawnmower, a carburetor, if it's turned really high, the engine may be sounding really like it's working hard. and you turn that little screw on the carburetor and it goes, you can hear it calm down. You can hear it relax. So our nervous system is the same way, that we may have a very, very activated brainstem, and we're at a very high level of adrenaline, even at rest. So even when we're resting, our body is ready to, run from the lion or fight the lion, or we're ready to spring into defensiveness with a comment from someone, or anger at somebody's comments. And it's not because necessarily what they're doing or saying, it's because we're wired for survival. And that can become our default mode, right? It can become the way the brain is forcing us to be. We're essentially not free at that point. We are being driven by our brainstem, right? It's like being at the high school with the fire alarm on all the time. You can't get an education. You can't finish that math test. You can't practice that jump shot because you're in fight or flight mode. So as it says here, unless we make a conscious effort to reverse that polarity from the brainstem, our feelings and thoughts are contextualized by this survival mode, this default mode. And so one of these default modes is the fight or flight one. There's others, but that's the one that I thought we could use for today. And social dominance is another version of fight or flight, where we feel like our purpose in life is to control or boss around or be dominant over others. And so all of this comes from this primitive brainstem capacity that derives from the brainstem. And in Bahá'í terminology, these two functions of the higher abilities and these survival functions are called our higher nature and our lower nature, just as another vocabulary for what we've been talking about. So now, neural networks, neural circuits can get stuck. Simple idea. So imagine a neural circuit that is derived from the fight or flight response that is over determined, is the psychological term, where a particular circuit is playing way more than it needs to. So, and that might be becoming angry when we perceive slights, when we don't need to, or becoming fearful when we don't need to, or generalizing our fear to all sorts of things that undermines our ability to do things we'd love to do, or to engage the world the way we'd like to, or be with our loved ones, or venture out of the house even in some cases. These are neural circuits, neural networks that are stuck, right? And I just put this picture in because people my age can remember back when we had record players and the needle would get stuck, let's say, on a little scratch on the record, and the record wouldn't play. It would just keep skipping back and forth over and over again. The brain does this. And one way to think about what we've termed mental disorders is that they're stuck neural circuits. It's not necessarily the way you were raised or your parents, or it's a neural circuit that's stuck. Now, it has all those meanings associated with it, with the way we were raised and things, but the stuckness of it makes it feel like it's who we really are, and that it's somehow our fate. Okay, now the next one. Or, the little bit later generation, remember that horrible sound that a skipping CD would make? Yeah, it's the same thing with the brain. If the brain is stuck in a horrible thought process, I have patients right now who, for instance, have a version of OCD where they all they think about is death, or all they think about is the death of their children, or their death of themselves, or being hurt or hurting someone else. And it's not anything they want to do, but it's a stuck neural circuit. So now, all right. So the basic idea that these neural networks can get stuck. And okay, so the idea is, in our spiritual growth, in our growth as a human being, we don't want to be the person whose life is driven by their brainstem. We want to be the person whose life is driven by their cortex, the best of them. We want to be the person who's cultivated those refined and higher parts of our nature. So basically, we don't want to be a lizard. So don't be a lizard. All right, so now I wanted to give you a really dramatic example of how this works in a clinical practice, just to make the point. I want to talk to you about something called transcranial magnetic stimulation to illustrate the points we've been talking about. Now, that's me holding what they call a coil of something that's called a transcranial magnetic stimulator, which is that device right behind me in the picture. You notice that little thing, it looks like a little paddle that I'm holding with my left hand. It's a little bit curved, and it's designed to fit against and lay on a person's head. Now I'll show you what happens next. So here's an example of a patient getting a TMS, or a transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment. Now, this is all about that idea of stuck neural networks. This person, for instance, let's say they've been depressed for ages, and they've tried medications and all sorts of things, and nothing has helped them. So this stuck neural network that keeps them depressed hasn't changed. What this device does is it uses a magnetic pulse, a certain kind of a magnetic pulse, to loosen up those stuck neural networks where they actually dissolve. They let go of the brain. And as a result of that neural network that's stuck, being de-energized, so to speak, that means the rest of the brain can work. The rest of the brain can wake up and go, oh, thank God, I've been stuck, I've been waiting to have my chance to contribute to my happiness, but that stuck neural network wouldn't let me. So a TMS device unsticks the brain. Fascinating. Now, here's an example. Look at that image of a brain on the left. That's an example of a person who is depressed. And if you'll notice, there's very few parts of that brain that are active. The white parts of that diagram on the left, or that picture, it's a real picture, is only a small percentage of the brain is active. And this is an example of how constrained a person who's depressed, how constrained their life feels, that it's difficult to think about work, difficult to think about connection with friends or doing things you love, or that life holds anything meaningful. So thinking in the cortex there, the cortical part of the brain, is limited. It's not very active. Now look at the brain on the right. That's a brain that it's actually the same person. A few weeks later, after they finished TMS treatment, you can see all kinds of parts of their brain that are now active, that were not allowed to be active by those stuck neural circuits. Now the person can feel normally, and they can have a range of feelings, a range of thoughts that aren't stuck in self-blame or self-criticism or chronic feelings of sadness. They can have a range of appropriate feelings and appropriate thoughts. So this is a dramatic example of what we've been talking about, that brain circuitry determines how we think, feel, and act, that brain circuits can get stuck, and there's things we can do to unstick them. Now, this is a device that does that using a magnetic pulse, but there's all sorts of things that can release not only the things that a TMS device can, but our higher nature. And that's where we're headed in our conversation. So now, let me tell you about a patient I had who just finished a week or two ago in her TMS treatment. She came in horribly, horribly distressed, a young lady, could not get very, very, very tragically sad thoughts out of her head about herself, and could not get the thought of suicide out of her head. She was desperate to find a way to just get some relief from these chronic thoughts that were just playing in her head constantly. So after a couple of days of treatment, it's a treatment that goes on for 36 days. So I saw her every day for 36 days. So a couple of days into it, she I mentioned something about the effects it was having, and instantly she was able to formulate this very sophisticated question from what I had said. So her perceptions had accurately heard what I said. She processed it, that perception accurately, drew conclusions about what it might mean for the future, and then speculated on outcomes that she had questions about. So in a fraction of a second, she exhibited 5 or 6 very, very dramatic and powerful cognitive skills. And I said to her, my gosh, look what you just did. You just showed 4 or 5 very, very significant cognitive skills, and I named them for her. And I said, that's what a doctor needs to do. I wonder if you ever thought about being a doctor. And she said, be a doctor. You know, I was in special ed my whole school career, and people always told me I was stupid. No one's ever told me I have a strength. So the point of this is to say that she had never known that she has strengths. She didn't know that, she didn't even have a language for her higher self, or for her, or not even her completely higher self, just for the a part of her that can think clearly. She had no vocabulary even for it. We find this all the time with my work as a psychiatrist, that people rarely have a language for their strengths. So the point of bringing this up is that something like TMS, in waking up parts of the brain, it's also waking up capacities, because these new parts of the brain are associated with strengths, with abilities, with nuanced capacities and perspectives. So this is a really important point, because it's going to really be the bedrock of where we're headed in our discussion about spirituality. That it's the expression, it's the discovery and expression of these latent capacities we talked about. That is one of the primary functions and goals and purposes of a spiritual life. It defines a spiritual life far more than a belief system or a set of a doctrine. It's an emergence of capacity, an emergence of gem-like capacities. And I love that analogy of a gem, which is derived from one of Baha'u'llah's quotes, where he says, regard man, meaning humanity, as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. That's a wonderful quote if you think about it, because a diamond, let's say, you could be standing on the surface of a vein of diamonds 100 feet under your feet, or 100 yards under your feet, or maybe right under your feet, and not realize they're there. So knowing that we have latent capacity, knowing that the cortex is meant to have these capacities developed, that they require our conscious attention and cultivation, knowing that that's what it's, our life is largely about, that's very empowering for us. That it's the search for these capacities, it's the valuing these capacities, it's the choosing them, putting them into practice, strengthening them. This is what some of the core features of what a spiritual path and our growth psychologically and spiritually is about. All right, now we're going to transition now from the brain to some concepts about spirituality and what we mean by it. But I'm going to start with this quote from Abdu'l-Baha in the Bahá'í writings, where he says, spiritual feelings have a surprising effect on healing nervous ailments. Spiritual feelings have a surprising effect on healing nervous ailments. Now, remember the brainstem and the midbrain and the cortex in that diagram I showed you before. If the brainstem is in control of our being, it's only going to prioritize 2 emotions, anger and fear, right? And those are our survival emotions. But pretty much all our other emotions are going to be subservient to those two emotions. So we won't primarily have the experience of loving kindness or compassion or bliss or wonder, gratitude. Think of a feeling that is elevated and joining and life affirming. Those feelings are not available to us when we are driven by our brainstem, when we are angry or fearful. So spiritual feelings have a surprising effect on healing nervous ailments. And that's because it means that feelings are being activated that quiet the norepinephrine of the brainstem. It allows us to equilibrate our brain and get it unstuck from these reverberating, stuck neural circuits we were talking about. This picture was at the Newtown New Year celebration a couple of years ago, and it was even more fun than it looks. So was that a spiritual feeling? Yeah, I think so. I think it was. So, while we're here, I just want to give a definition of spirituality that can help guide us through the rest of this presentation. I don't think of spirituality as belief systems or as a doctrine or as a list of things that one values necessarily. I think of spirituality as the ability to quiet that brainstem and move into the process of bringing out those latent capacities. And that involves many things. And one way one language I've used for that is that it involves moving into a transcendent notion of the self. Suffering and anger and fear have a way of consolidating and rigidifying and making small our identity. We very much become focused on ourself when we suffer, and especially when we have anger or fear. But the spiritual feelings move us the other way, move us to inclusion and even thoughts of no thoughts of ourselves, but thoughts of our connection to the wider universe and certainly to other people. All right. So here we go. So I wanted to talk about ways to think about these spiritual states, that if it's not a belief system and adherence to a belief system, which is a part of, I think, maybe a religious approach to life, and I'm not saying it's not important, but a spiritual state, a spiritual condition can have many expressions. There are many experiential states that one can describe as spiritual. And I just put a few descriptors here that we can go over more as if we have time. And I see that I'm talking too much. So the first thing about spirituality is that it is transcendent. It is moving out of oneself and either experiencing a sense of universal grace or connection to the river of life, feeling intimately blessed by being present in the unfoldment of life. So it has a transcendent nature. A mother or a father who becomes a parent and suddenly their whole world is changed. That's a dramatic, powerful, maybe one of the most powerful spiritual states of transcendence. So this expanded self. Now, another thing about spiritual states, it's not always, sometimes it's very peaceful and quiet and gentle, but it's also, there are spiritual states that are passionate, that are consuming, that burn away notions of self and notions of that are determined by those stuck neural networks. So one thing you see in the life of a person who is experiencing various spiritual states, one of those spiritual states is passion. And another spiritual state that might even be considered on the opposite spectrum of that is being non-reactive, where the world is not defining your thinking, feeling, and behaving, but you observe the world and bring those gem-like qualities to deal with the world in a constructive way that brings out more spiritual states in yourself and other people, instead of being reactive from the brainstem with fear and anger. Another spiritual state is intuition, and the ability to be quiet and listen for new insights, to use more and more refined levels of perception that are not available and are deliberately shut off when we are in the fight or flight mode. We can't be thinking about how, I wonder, what's going on with that beautiful fern that I see as I'm running away from the tiger. That's the last thing you need. You need to be entirely focused on running. So intuition is a sign of spiritual progress, spiritual state. The next is what I'm calling sincerity, and this means a wholeness. I have another patient right now who came to me completely committed to killing himself, utterly convinced he was going to kill himself. He was coming to see me really as a courtesy to his mother, so he could say that he did everything he possibly could, and she could see that this is what he confided in me, not what he said to her, that he was going through the motions so that she wouldn't feel guilty that she hadn't tried everything, but he was determined to kill himself. And after a couple of sessions, I said to him, one of the things I really like, now this is going to sound strange, but something like this is what I said. I said, what I really like about your suicidal thinking, and I know it sounds crazy, I said, you're 100% committed to it. Now, I said, I know that sounds weird, but I said, what that tells me is that you have a powerful yearning for life, and you haven't felt like you've connected. You don't feel like life has given you any reason to be here, that your efforts haven't resulted in anything. And because you value life so much, not being able to feel life and connected to it makes you feel it's not worth it and you'd rather be gone. So to me, what that says is the irony is that your suicidality is actually a proof of how much you love life. You just don't know how to connect to it. And then I saw his eyes kind of, like, wait a minute. And that began a conversation about his sincerity, that he is unusually committed to finding meaning and wants to fully experience the passion of life, the gifts of life. He just didn't know how. And that changed everything. So the capacity for sincerity, to be completely present and committed to the wonder of life. That's what I mean by sincerity. And this unific concept is that we seek and we are able to connect to the reality of our connection to all that is. One of the greatest causes of depression and anxiety I find in this culture and with my patients is that they don't feel connected to anything, to their siblings, their parents, to their own life, to their own feelings, to the world, to certainly not the earth. So this notion of disconnection is, I think, one of the biggest pathology generators in the world. And a spiritual state is the opposite: feeling connected and grateful and in wonder, and because of that. Now, the other is detachment, that being able to like this young man I was telling you about who was suicidal. He said, I want to kill myself is because I don't see any value in this culture that, it's all about advertising and likes and getting people to like you on Facebook and stuff. He said it's all so empty and vacuous, and I don't believe any of it, and so I don't want any part of it. So, and we talked about that in the context not of despair, which of course it generated in him, but that it showed how he was very principled and able to detach himself from what the society was telling him what was important. Okay. Now, and finally, love. And I put that in caps because there's a million versions of love. But one of the maybe the most important overarching concept of a spiritual state is the unfolding of the multitudinous and varieties of forms of love that can flow through one in one's life. So, okay, let's keep going. Now, so a spiritual state then, to me, is altering that default mode from the brainstem and flipping it up into the cortex, altering that into the prefrontal cortex. And I just wanted to show you, we know what parts of the brain are involved in that process: the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex in general. There's others, but that's the core, the core anatomy. All right, so now let's look at this presentation mostly as an outline. There's plenty of methodologies we can go into later, and I promise we're getting close to the end. I wanted to talk about something in the Baha'i writings that addresses these points we've been making. Abdu'l-Baha, who is the son of Baha'u'llah, and we call Abdu'l-Baha the master, and all you have to do is learn anything about him, and you'll see why. But he talks about the movement from that lower nature to the higher nature requires a force. It requires a capacity. It requires, you could say, a fire being lit. It requires a light being shed upon those latent capacities. And he calls that the spirit of faith. But it could be called any number of things. It could be called, the universal love. It could be called, grace. It could be, there's a million different words for it. But the point is that there's a state of being where we are open to, welcome, and have prepared ourselves for this cortical unfolding to happen. And again, Abdu'l-Baha calls this the spirit of faith. And it has the force to reverse that brain polarity we've been talking about. And so it's not a belief, right? You can believe in the oneness of humanity, the oneness of religion, the oneness of God, but that's not going to provide you with the force to change the anger you have a habit of expressing, or the fear that keeps you from pursuing your career, or the things that you're meant to do in life, or it's not going to provide you with the stamina to do the right thing when there's pressures on you. So we want to explore this spirit of faith and how it awakens those latent gems. That's really the defining the action steps, which is coming up now. So part of that spirit of faith, one of the conditions of it, and I wrote this small because I could have done it in big letters and things, but I wanted to just keep it clear. Passionate love. Passionate love. How do we ignite passionate love? And not just belief, but passionate love for life, for all that is creation, for all that is mysterious, for all that is strange and wonderful, for all that is confusing, for all that is even constraining us. How do we yearn? How do we develop a passionate love? Because love is generated in let me say that again. That state of faith, that state of receptivity is generated when we begin with the state of love. Life then answers us with the greater love. So kindling this love is critical, and how we do that, I think, is a huge topic. The next one I put is yearning. Like this young man who was suicidal, is yearning to find a way to connect to the world, is yearning to find meaning and something that wasn't superficial. And our culture and my profession called him anxious and called him depressed. But what he really was yearning for purpose. He was yearning for meaning. He was yearning for connection and yearning for love, right? And so we just redefined those things that my profession would call symptoms and say, no, do not get rid of this yearning. It's really important. Value it and yearn more. abandonment. Now, I don't mean like being abandoned by your parents. I mean willing to be completely consumed in passionate love, or in this yearning search, being completely committed to it. It gets back to sincerity and detachment. And so I put that as the next one: surrender, a willingness to let go of concepts of who we think we are, a willingness to let go of the urgency that our anxiety tells us we need to feel, being willing to let go of the anxiety itself, or the fear that underlies it, that our life will be ruined if we don't get this one thing fixed. Being willing to let go and have a bigger experience than these stuck circuits keep us repeating over and over, so that a dawn can happen, something new can happen, a bigger experience can happen, and we can begin in the spirit of faith to start to explore the cultivation of these gems and the expression of them in our lives, and the sharing of them with others, and uniting with others around our shared as well as our diverse expressions of these gems. So friends, I wanted to ask you to please, if you're watching this as a recording, I'd like you to write in the comments areas in which you'd like to have these thoughts brought to bear in your life in a way that would help you. If it's with some anxiety or depression or a life situation, or parenting, couples, relationships, work, whatever it might be, how we get through this crazy time we're in, let's start thinking how we can bring this higher nature to these issues. What I did in this presentation wasn't so much to outline the experience of those spiritual states, which I think we really should do, but we didn't have time. So what I wanted to do instead was simply frame the issue. All right, I think I better stop there because I'm way over time. All right then, friends, thank you so much, and I'll give it back to our hosts. Let's see now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed that. Now we have some time for questions, so people can put their questions in the chat. One question is, how can we forgive and forget? Actually, I can forgive right away, but can't forget.
Yeah. There's a story of Mahatma Gandhi where someone came up to him and said, "Bapu, I know that you said, I know that I shouldn't smoke. It's bad for my health, and I really want to quit. Can you teach me how to quit smoking?" And he said, "Yes, I can. And he said, "Oh, good. Please tell me. And Gandhi said, "Well, I want you to come back in 30 days. And the person said, "Well, okay. All right." So he went away. 30 days later, he comes back and he says to Gandhi, "Bapu, I'm back. You said you'd teach me how to quit smoking. 30 days have gone by. But why did you make me wait 30 days? And Gandhi said, "First, I had to quit smoking." So you ask me how to forgive and forget. I'm learning how to forgive and forget. I don't want to pretend like I have a handle on all this. It's one of the biggest challenges, isn't it? And I think it's only possible when we let go of a definition of ourselves that is so seductively compelling, that we think that if we're insulted, if that idea of ourself is demeaned, that we feel that the core of us has been damaged. And so we are reacting in anger or fear to the person who did these things to us. One of the ways that a very interesting quote of Baha'u'llah, who's the founder of the Bahá'í Faith, when they were imprisoned in the prison city of Akka. And this is after years of exile and torture and confinement in prisons, chains, being poisoned for decades. He said, okay, there were some people who killed some Baha'is in Akka, and there was the court of Akka arrested the murderers, and they brought them to trial. And some of the Baha'is were asked to be witnesses, and the witnesses pleaded for forgiveness of the murderers and asked that they be let go. Baha'u'llah said that his religion had taken root then, at that point, because these individuals who were terribly aggrieved, their loved ones had been killed, they forgave. And that's the core of Jesus's teachings too, isn't it? To love your enemies as yourself. So this is, I think, a tremendously elevated state, one we're all called to, and one that is difficult until it's really easy. Now, there's another a tablet of Abdul Baha called the Book of the Covenant, where he talks about the people who oppressed him for decades and plotted his death and tried to have him crucified. And he pleads in this document for their forgiveness and for their happiness. I think the only way this can be done is when the higher self is activated, when we don't see our own small self as who we really are, but that the rest of that brain capacity is opened up, let's say, by the spirit of faith, and we are not the one who's injured. Nothing can injure us, like our core. So that state is what we need to be after. And in that state, forgiveness is possible. Forgetting might not be appropriate. It might be appropriate to remember to be sure that you protect yourself from being mistreated and that justice happens. But there are other times too when forgiveness also means forgetting. So this balance between forgiveness and justice is really a really important one. And I don't think there's a pat answer for it, because on the one hand, we do need to protect ourselves from being, unfairly treated. But when something happens that's, say, not so much a legal matter as it is a personal betrayal or a personal insult, these things really ask of us to something higher. I'm struggling with something like this right now with people very close to me who did something incomprehensible to me, and finding that heart of forgiveness has been a daily process, and something that's a part of my prayers. I start with, whenever I think of them, I pray for them. Right, I just start there, and all the rest of the thinking about it, I try not to go there. I just stay with what Abdul Baha did, which is pray for them, and then try to do it as sincerely as I can. And I'm making slow progress.
Thank you. Baha'u'llah speaks of the soul as independent of the body, yet we also see real changes in brain chemistry with prayer and meditation. How should we think about that relationship?
Yeah, how much time have we got? So the Abdul Baha, in Some Answered Questions, has insights, really important insights into this. And just a simple metaphor that he uses, which I think is actually quite profound if we just think about it and stay with it for a while, is this idea that our spirit, the thing that is our soul, our rational soul and spirit, he says those are the same thing, or they're like the sun and the ray of the sun. There's our soul, and then the rational spirit, or the rational soul, the spirit that emanates from it, and then that emanation engages through our physical form, right? So our mental capacities and these gem-like qualities are things that are unfolded as that rational spirit becomes illumined by the spirit of faith, and these capacities start unfolding. Abdu'l-Baha also says that the soul of a person is not affected by affirmities of the body, right? So in other words, that sun is not affected by or that spirit is not affected by the body's infirmities. So a brilliant soul who gets a brain injury and then becomes violent or loses their memory, those are bodily infirmities. It's the hardware that's being damaged, but I guess you could say the program is unaffected. That's not a good example, but I would I'd ask you to read those chapters and some answered questions, like page 143, somewhere in there. But Abdu'l-Baha also says that it's not just infirmities of the body, but while we're healthy and growing, that it's vain imaginings and idle fancies, vain imaginings, things that limit our perception of who we are or keep us stuck in one of those neural networks that just keeps playing over and again. I'm better than you. I'm better than everybody. Why doesn't everybody see how great I am? Or you're no good. I'm no good. Nobody's good. Take your pick. These thoughts that just keep reverberating. These are the first things that need to be quieted and let go of. And especially the emotional intensity that goes with them, which speaks to the profound necessity for meditation and prayer and the quieting of those neural networks, the quieting of the brainstem. It's not enough to believe in the oneness of God. Experience it, the quiet that brainstem. I'm going off track a little bit. But please, what else do we got?
Thank you. Can you tell us some more about the spirit of faith?
Abdu'l-Baha has, let's see. Abdu'l-Baha calls it several things, but it's that condition where that we've found that lower nature, that brainstem stuckness, is entirely unsatisfying and destructive in our lives. So we're trying to find a way to activate these cortical aspects of who we are. We're trying to find a way to move into our spiritual perceptions, our spiritual capacities, these higher capacities that the cortex has latently embedded within them. But he says that it requires a power, it requires a force, because this is a really strong evolutionary drive that we're reversing. So he says that's what he calls the spirit of faith. And it has several qualities to it. And one of the things Abdu'l-Baha describes it, the spirit of faith, as the bounty of God. And if you've had an experience, let's say in prayer or meditation, or something happens to you, and let's say something almost miraculous seems to have happened, where an insight happens, or there's a sudden lifting of a burden, or there's a profound sense of connection, and the gift of life seems suddenly to kind of burst within you. Christians call it a reborn experience, or something like that. That is a sign of the spirit of faith, because we what happens is fear stops being a motivator, right? But this notion that we are connected to this joyful unfolding, that becomes something that's very, very hugely attractive. It becomes the lodestar for our life. In the long healing prayer, Baha'u'llah talks about God as being the bringer of delight and the mysterious, or the hidden one, right? And he says, as a result of, I had that spiritual delight, but now he's hidden. And as a result, he says he's yearned, or the one I yearn for is essentially the idea. So that yearning becomes an essential metric of the spirit of faith. So look for that in the Baha'i writings, where there's a statement of God's or Baha'u'llah's loftiness and this great state, and then right after it, there'll be a yearning statement about wanting to go there, right? You know, it's in the long obligatory prayer, long healing prayer. It's in throughout the writings. You'll see this kind of ratcheting of a statement of sublimity and a spiritual state, and oh, how much I want that, and it's like you're just ratcheting up. So the spirit of faith, we won't be pursuing those kinds of states unless that we've made a place in our heart for something much bigger. One last example. I've had many patients who are alcoholic or heroin addicts who were not able to stop their addiction, right? And just one gentleman in particular, his story strikes me as that, he was, brought to a hospital by his kids after he destroyed his car and the police had been chasing him, and he didn't remember any of it. They brought him to a hospital. He was in delirium tremens, which is lethal for many people. And he just said, God, take this from me. And he said he just suddenly felt that it lifted from him, and he felt this life pour into him. So you can think of that in kind of abstract spiritualistic ways, which is fine, but you can also think of it as he let go of a notion of himself and was wide open and sincerely wide open to something new. So there's that detachment and that sense of surrender. So these components, it's probably important that we talk about the components that are required to attract the spirit of faith. This kind of passion, this kind of abandonment, this sense of yearning, and ultimately it leads to what the prayer that was sung at the beginning, that we then trust, that we have a sense of, yes, I'm okay. I trust and one last thing, and then I want to, in a profoundly important tablet of Abdul Baha to the northeastern states, in something called the Tablets of the Divine Plan, Abdul Baha repeatedly talks about these states, and I mean states of the United States, not spiritual states. He talks about how every area of the world has its own unique gifts. But this area, he says, is uniquely gifted with faith and assurance. And Abdul Baha had this way of talking about people's capacity, their potential, even when it wasn't obvious. Like, so he would say to an alcoholic, you have this wonderful ability to be clear-headed and sober, but he was just the opposite when Abdul Baha was saying this to him. So one looks at the culture in New England, and it's the opposite of faith and assurance. But by faith is meant this. My take, one brief notion of faith, is that I am willing to let go of my notions of myself and trust, right, and I am assured then that I am in interaction, I am in relationship to a force, the forces of nature that are the forces of God, of Baha'u'llah, that are moving through life, and they've engaged me, and I'm gratefully involved in that unfolding faith and assurance.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So this question is, the biggest challenge is to change our thoughts. How do we replace bad thoughts with good ones? It is very difficult.
Yeah, it is. It's maybe one of the hardest things ever in life. Well, to respect the question would require a lot, right? Because there's slightly different answers for different kinds of thoughts. But I think when one is let me think for a second to give you a good answer. My take is there's probably multiple ways to approach this question. There are biological ways. For instance, my TMS device, right? It helps people with thoughts of chronic suicide or chronic homicidality or chronic hatred or chronic depression, especially depression and anxiety, anxious thoughts. So that's when the level of the problem is at a neural network level, at the circuitry of the brain. But what if the problem is at a level of the metabolism of brain cells, and then you're deficient in vitamin D, or you need a methylene tetrahydrofolic acid reductase to help you methylate folate, or there's a whole bunch of biological reasons that a person gets stuck in one of these neural networks. Then there's the psychological elements, which can be fed by our focus and by what we're choosing. Now, my take is, for everyone, we need to cultivate different experiences of self, right? And if our only experience of self is the self as angry, or the self as aggrieved, or the self as fearful, we're going to have a really hard time getting out of it. So we need to cultivate more notions of what we are. And this is the vital role of prayer and meditation. The prayers of Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha are extremely important. And that's a subject of another presentation. But the reason is because they come from that place of the experience of this transcendent nature, right? And so you get educated. Oh, wow, I didn't know you could feel that. And and then you start to feel the stirring of it. And then you yearn to have more of it. And then you start looking for more ways to experience it. You start expanding the notion of self until you come to the point that self's not, you don't really need to be that angry self. So now this is a very simplistic way of describing something that's much more complex and difficult. But in a nutshell, that's the process. And getting help for, maybe medical causes, if there are medical causes. Yeah, I would invite, knowing that we're wrapping up here, it would be wonderful, either now for those who are in the live broadcast, or those who are watching, please put this in a question like that in the comments. And I'm actually going to, okay, let's do this. If I could ask the Parhamis, maybe we could have a series of discussions about specific applications of these ideas about how to unfold spiritual capacity in depression, or with anxiety, or with problems with parenting, or in couples, or teens who are struggling with suicidality, or people who are autistic or trying to find connection. I think that would be really, really valuable. And it would be moving the conversation from just kind of beliefs into, like, how do I get through today, right? And how does my life become, what it's supposed to be?
Definitely. Yeah, we would love to make this a series and have more, narrower topics on different, like, practical things. So that would be really great. So thank you so much. We really appreciated this. And yes, this recording will be on YouTube. I've put the link to our YouTube channel so you can subscribe, and we'll get that posted, and you can continue the conversation there in the comments. And yes, we'd love to have you back, Dr. Woodall, for another talk, or to even make this a series. So thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys. Thank you so much. God bless you.
And our speaker next week will be Mr. Eugene Yazdani, and his topic will be Finding Purpose in Service, My Path in the Baha'i Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week at the same time. Bye.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much.